There is a moment in time that most people lived through, but almost no one noticed. It wasn't announced. There were no alarms, no breaking headlines, no single event that forced the world to stop and look at itself. Instead, it was quieter than that, hidden inside numbers, buried in datasets, scattered across graphs that, on their own, meant nothing. But when those numbers are placed together, aligned in the right way, they reveal something unsettling. A shift, a fracture, a point where the direction of society didn't just change, it bent. And once you see it, once you understand what happened at that point, it becomes impossible to look at the modern world the same way again. Because this isn't just about data. This is about the exact moment when everything started to break. At first, everything looks normal. That's what makes it so difficult to detect. If you go back to the early 2000s, the graphs appear stable, almost predictable. Economic growth moves in steady waves. Social behavior follows patterns that researchers had studied for decades. Human interaction, though imperfect, remains consistent. There is noise in the data, of course, there always is, but nothing that suggests a fundamental shift. Nothing that hints at collapse. And that's exactly why what happens next is so easy to miss. Because the change doesn't begin with chaos. It begins with something far more subtle, a deviation so small that it feels insignificant. Around the late 2000s, something begins to move. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to register. A slight increase in reported stress levels. A marginal decline in life satisfaction. A barely noticeable rise in social isolation. On their own, these changes don't mean much. In fact, most analysts at the time dismissed them as temporary fluctuations, normal responses to economic uncertainty, especially in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And that explanation made sense. When financial systems collapse, people feel it. Anxiety rises. Stability weakens. But here's the part that almost no one paid attention to: the data didn't recover. If the crisis were the cause, the graphs should have returned to baseline once the economy stabilized. That's what historical patterns suggest. But this time, something different happened. The numbers didn't bounce back. They continued drifting, slowly, quietly, in a direction that didn't align with any previous model. And this is where the pattern begins to reveal itself. Because when you overlay multiple datasets, mental health indicators, time use surveys, social interaction metrics, and digital consumption, you start to see synchronization. Independent systems, moving together. Not randomly, not coincidentally, but in a way that suggests a shared underlying force. It's not one graph dropping. It's many. It's not one behavior changing. It's a network of behaviors shifting at the same time. And then, somewhere between 2010 and 2012, the shift becomes undeniable. There is a point, an inflection point, where the slope of multiple graphs changes direction almost simultaneously. Screen time begins to accelerate. Face-to-face interaction declines at a faster rate. Reported loneliness increases, not gradually, but sharply. Attention spans begin to shorten in measurable ways. Even sleep patterns start to fragment. And what makes this moment so significant is not just the change itself, but the speed of it. Systems that once evolved slowly begin to move rapidly, almost as if something has been introduced that compresses time, something that amplifies behavior and feeds on it. At first, researchers struggled to explain it. Traditional models didn't fit. Economic recovery was underway. Technology was advancing, but advancement alone had never produced such synchronized behavioral shifts before. There had to be something else. Something that connected these patterns. Something that operated across different domains at once. And then the answer began to emerge, not as a single discovery, but as a realization that had been forming quietly in the background. It wasn't just technology. It was the way technology had changed. Before this point, digital systems were passive. They provided information, facilitated communication, and responded to user input. But around this time, they began to evolve into something more active. Algorithms started shaping experiences. Feeds became personalized. Content was no longer just delivered, it was optimized. And optimization, by its nature, seeks engagement. It learns from behavior, adapts to it, and then amplifies it. This is where the pattern deepens. Because when you analyze user behavior data from this period, you notice something unusual. Engagement doesn't just increase, it becomes more concentrated. People spend longer periods of time in digital environments, but their interactions become narrower. More repetitive, more fragmented. The diversity of experience decreases, even as the volume increases. And this has consequences that extend far beyond the screen. Human attention is not unlimited. It is a finite resource. And when it becomes fragmented, when it is constantly redirected, interrupted, and re-engaged, it begins to lose depth. Tasks that once required sustained focus become more difficult. Conversations become shorter. Reflection becomes rarer. And over time, this shift in attention begins to influence how people perceive the world itself. But the most revealing data doesn't come from usage patterns. It comes from correlation. When researchers began comparing digital consumption with mental health metrics, they found something that changed the direction of the conversation entirely. The rise in screen time aligned almost perfectly with increases in anxiety, depression, and feelings of isolation, especially among younger demographics. Not loosely, not vaguely, but with a level of precision that is difficult to ignore. And this is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable. Because it suggests that the same systems designed to connect people may also be contributing to their disconnection. But the pattern doesn't stop there. Economic data adds another layer. While productivity increases, perceived financial security declines. People work more, yet feel less stable. Income inequality widens, but the perception of inequality grows even faster. Expectations shift. Comparisons intensify. And once again, digital environments play a role, exposing individuals to curated realities that distort benchmarks of success. The result is a feedback loop. Increased exposure leads to increased comparison. Increased comparison leads to decreased satisfaction. Decreased satisfaction leads to increased engagement. And increased engagement feeds the system that amplifies the cycle. This is not speculation. It is pattern recognition. And it reveals something that only becomes visible when multiple datasets are viewed together. But perhaps the most subtle, and most profound, change occurs in how people relate to time. Before this shift, time was experienced in larger segments. Days were structured. Activities had clear boundaries. But as digital systems became more integrated into daily life, those boundaries began to dissolve. Moments became fragmented. Attention shifted rapidly from one input to another. And over time, this fragmentation altered perception itself. People began to feel busier, even when they weren't necessarily doing more. They felt more connected, while interacting less deeply. They felt informed, while understanding less. Context. This is the paradox at the center of the pattern. And it is not immediately visible. It has to be uncovered. Because from the outside, the world appears to be progressing. Technology improves. Access increases. Communication becomes faster. But beneath that surface, the data tells a different story, a story of trade-offs that were never fully understood at the time they were made. And this brings us back to the original question. When did society start breaking? Not collapsing, not failing completely, but bending, shifting in a way that changed its trajectory. The answer is not a single date. It is a window, a period where multiple systems crossed a threshold at the same time. Where technology became active instead of passive. Where attention became fragmented instead of focused. Where connection became optimized instead of organic. And where the cumulative effect of these changes began to reshape behavior on a global scale. But here is the part that only becomes clear when you step back even further. The pattern is still unfolding. The graphs have not stabilized. The trends have not reversed. If anything, they have accelerated. Which means the inflection point was not the end of the change. It was the beginning. And understanding that changes how you see everything that comes after. Because once you recognize the pattern, You begin to notice it in places you didn't expect. In conversations that feel shorter. In habits that feel harder to control. In moments where attention drifts without warning. These are not isolated experiences. They are signals, small reflections of a larger system that is still shaping itself in real time. And the most unsettling part is this. The system does not require awareness to function. It does not need people to understand it. It operates regardless, quietly, efficiently, continuously, which raises a question that the data alone cannot answer. If the shift that began over a decade ago is still influencing behavior today, then what does that mean for the future? Because patterns, once established, tend to persist. They evolve, they adapt, but they rarely disappear on their own. And if the forces that created this shift remain active, if the incentives that drive them continue to exist, then the trajectory may already be set. Not in detail, but in direction. So the real question is not just when society started to break. It's whether we are still moving along the same path, without realizing how far it has already taken us. Because the most powerful changes are not always the ones that happen suddenly. Sometimes, they are the ones that happen so gradually, so quietly, that by the time they are visible, they have already reshaped everything.